So with that, we have some plant anatomy. So the first thing is the fact that plants have three basic, you could call them organs if you like that word, and those would be the roots, the shoots, and, well, the leaves, which we'll get to on another one. So you basically divide it up. You've got the underground part, mostly the roots. You've got the stems or the shoots, and the main purpose of those is just to kind of connect them to the third major structure, the leaves. And so we could go into a lot of detail on each of these structures, and your book does a little bit more, but starting off with the roots. Now you have root tips and you have root hairs. Now someone tell me, what is an overall function of a root? Okay, take in water and minerals, good.
Hold it.
Anchor the plant, good, hold it down. Store energy, good. Those are three great structures or functions right there. They hold the plant, they allow water and minerals to come in, and they store some of those photosynthetic products as well, right? They store energy. So that's their structure. Now, why is their function so good to that? Well, think about the anchoring. They have all of these different roots, all these, especially fibrous roots, right, from those monocots. Branches all off, and soil gets wrapped around it, right, and holds on really tight. So even in a strong wind, the thing's not blowing out or blowing over. You have these root hairs. Root hairs don't have anything to do with anchoring, but if you ever look at a root and you see all these fuzzinesses on the roots, that's increasing the surface area a huge amount. And so you have all this surface area, and the more surface area you have, the more water and minerals you can take in, right? And so it maximizes the efficiency of taking in that liquid. Then you have the stems or the shoots. Well, not too much to know about that. Basically what we'll say for that is, well, we're trying to get up to the leaves because the leaves are where photosynthesis is going to happen, and the stems are going to help that in two ways. One, the higher your leaves are, the better chance that they have at uninterrupted light, right? If you can outcompete everything around you, if you can get your solar panels up above them, you get the maximum amount of light. And then second of all, since they're holding those leaves way up there, and those leaves need water to do photosynthesis, it's going to have to be able to transport that water up there. And then finally, the whole plant needs energy as well. And so that product of photosynthesis, those sugars that are being made in the leaves, also has to be redistributed throughout the plant so that that plant can have the energy it needs to be able to grow as well. We're not going to worry too much about buds at this point. We'll just kind of bypass that section. Finally, so there's our third main organ that wasn't up there. So we have the roots, the stems, and the leaves. You can also, your book divided up this way as well. We see two major systems. You have your root system and your shoot system. The shoot system includes both the stems and the leaves. And the leaves, we'll see a little snapshot of leaves here in a second, but the main tissue there is called mesophyll. And of course, the major thing we just need to know about leaves is that the leaves are the solar panels, right? The leaves are doing the photosynthesis, and we'll talk about their structure versus function in a minute. And so, in those leaves, we have veins. We saw the veins in the monocot versus dicot. Which ones had the branching veins? Dicot, good. And monocots had the parallel running veins. Another way we can tell between those two different classifications of angiosperms. So, in terms of kind of that idea with the roots again, one other kind of structure versus function thing is we get this Mycorrhizae thing again, which came up in the, which kingdom is this dealing with besides plants? Fungi, good, right? We talked about this. We had a similar slide in the fungi. A symbiotic relationship between fungi and plants, right? Symbiotic is just talking about you've got two things interacting with each other. And in this case, it would again be mutualism, right? They're both benefiting from this relationship. And so what the Mycorrhizae do in particular is they increase the absorption. The absorption of what? The water and the minerals. And so they're basically helping the roots. And it's kind of hard to see these pictures, but you have this fungi on the roots of plants, and you can kind of see the fuzziness maybe if I dim the lights there. And so you've got this fungus helping. It increases the surface area, and it also does something else. How do fungi get their nutrients?
By putting acid on them and slurping.
By putting acid on them and slurping? That's a good way to think of it, at least, right? It's extracellular. They're releasing their enzymes, is probably a little more technical, into the environment, which breaks down any organic matter in there, and then they kind of slurp it up. Well, if they're doing that around these roots, who else is slurping it up? The plants, right? And so it allows those trees and the plants to not only increase their surface area, but it also helps to kind of boost those minerals that the plant might be able to take in as well.
What exactly is the fungus getting out of it?
The fungus is getting out of it. It is attached to a photosynthetic organism, and so the fungus is basically getting nutrients, but the plant is helping to provide it with some of the energy from photosynthesis, so it can kind of tap into that energy source as well. And so again, increasing the surface area increases the volume of soil reached by the plant. It basically is adding to the root system and making that root system even more efficient by the whole extracellular digestion. And so that kind of, we can tack that on to the roots segment. Again, not a whole lot to say about the stem at this point. We'll talk a little bit about xylem and phloem coming up, and of course that's found in the stem and other parts as well. But for now, skipping ahead to the leaves. Now in the leaves are pretty complex structure, but most leaves are pretty flat, right? Or technically we call them broad. So they're kind of wide, they're flat, and, well, they're pretty much like solar panels. You want them to be wide because the wider they are, the more sunlight that's going to fall on them. And the more sunlight they capture, right? We covered photosynthesis pretty detailed. The more sunlight you capture, the more electrons are being jumped around, and the more photosynthesis is occurring, the more sugars that are being made. You also want it thin because of what's happening inside the leaves. For one, you have to have carbon dioxide, right? Remember the equation for photosynthesis. You have to have water. Where does that come in? From the roots all the way up the stem, all the way up to the leaves to that xylem. And it's H2O plus CO2. Where does CO2 come in? In the leaves, the stomatas. It comes in through those holes. Well, if your leaf is really thick and you have that carbon dioxide coming in through the holes on the bottom, it's going to be really hard to get that carbon dioxide all the way to the top of that leaf where the sun's hitting for photosynthesis. So you want it nice and thin so it doesn't have to travel very far. And finally, you're producing not just sugars, but what else is that plant producing? Oxygen, which wants to leave the plant. And so that needs to get out of those same stomatas, right? And so as that happens, again, if you're trying to transport that oxygen out, you want that leaf to be thin. So again, we get a nice kind of structure versus function relationship.
Can you, like, take a leaf and, like, you know how we were doing the experiment to make, like, longer hairs or whatever? Can you make a leaf broader by, like, chopping off the ones that don't measure? Like, could you change the variation of how broad a leaf is? Or would that take, like, hundreds of years?
The plant would have to have one leaf. And then it would be like, oh, you kill all the ones that were big or little, you know.
So you're saying like back on that evolution lab we did?
Yeah, like could you like make it, instead of doing root hairs, how? Yeah, artificial.
So if you chose plants that had the biggest leaves and only cross-pollinated those and did not cross-pollinate the smaller leaves?
Yeah, or like if you took a plant and like measured all
possibly
and like cut the ones that.
Possibly. The harder thing with that would be there's probably also not just a genetic factor on the side. It probably is genetic, but that more so than hairs also is probably affected by the environment. So it's hard to say exactly. I would think that you could probably steer it a little bit, but I think it'd be a little bit more complicated than the hairs. So the main function of leaves is photosynthesis, or the energy production and the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen production. That's basically saying sugar, right? C6H12O6. And in doing so, it's also going to be doing that gas exchange, oxygen out, carbon dioxide has to come in. And as we started talking about yesterday, there's this whole idea of transpiration. And so the reason why this transpiration is kind of a tricky process is, well, if you want to get the water up into your leaves, and you had some kind of technical questions about this on that reading guide that I just checked, if you're trying to get that water up the leaves, you have to let transpiration happen, right? It's part of the whole system that pulls that water up. Yet, if you have those open, you're also losing water. And most of the stats I read said things like 90% of the water can be lost out of those leaves, which only leaves 10% for actually photosynthesis. Some other things that I read, I can't remember if it was in your book, I think it was in the Campbell book. It was talking about a typical plot or typical plantings of corn. In a typical acre of corn, in one season, that corn will transpire 400,000 gallons of water. 1 acre of corn transpire 400,000 gallons of water in one season, which means that's a lot of water that farmer has to do if it's not raining, right? Because if you don't supply that water, they're going to start to wilt, photosynthesis is going to happen, those plants are going to die. But you're trying to let this transpiration out, well, you got to make sure you're not losing too much water. Meanwhile, if you say, oh, I don't want to lose any more water, I better shut these things down a little bit, now you're not getting any carbon dioxide in, which is you need for photosynthesis, and you're not letting oxygen out, which can build up. And you probably don't remember the term, but it was called photorespiration, which is where oxygen builds up, and oxygen will kind of gunk up the Kelvin cycle easier. It will, if it's available, things will use oxygen instead of carbon dioxide, and now you're not producing any sugars either. So it's this whole delicate balance of how they do that. And we'll look at those stomas, right? Stoma is singular, stomatas are plural, and of course we got the guard cells on each side that are opening and closing that window. We're not going to get into simple versus compound leaves. We'll just leave those for a different class. So here's some pictures that we saw back in photosynthesis as well. Again, you have some thin, they don't look quite as thin on that diagram, but in terms of layers of cells, there's not very many layers of cells there. You've got your guard cells with your stomas on the bottom. You have this very, well, it's called spongy mesophyll. And why is it spongy?
So air can get in there?
Good. So carbon dioxide can get in, oxygen can get out, and also water can travel through there without having to pass through all the cells. Because these cells right there, that is where you're doing photosynthesis. All right, these are the photosynthetic cells. So we got to get carbon dioxide to those. We got to get oxygen out of those. Here is your vein, which is going to be your xylem and phloem. So water is going to be released into that space. So some water can easily go right to the stoma, out of the xylem. Other water can go right to those cells that are going to do the photosynthesis. We've got our guard cells with our stomas that you can see in some of those pictures. Here is kind of showing you just a different cross-section. It's this palisade layer that's mostly doing the photosynthesis. You can see another cross-section of this whole thing is your vein in the leaf, right? The vein running through, half of which is the xylem, transporting the water. Half of it is the phloem, which is transporting the carbon dioxide products. I'm not so sure about this picture. You don't see too many plants with guard cells on the top, so I'm not quite sure where that's coming from. So as far as controlling the transpiration, I got a little bit ahead of myself talking about these things, but you've got to balance that compromise between photosynthesis and between transpiration, between losing too much water. Now remember, kind of going all the way back to that water transport, and some of those terms came up again in this chapter: water potential, solute potential, right? Pressure potential. Remember that animal cells did not have a pressure potential. Why not? Good. No cell wall. Plants do have a cell wall, and that's called when those plants fill up, they don't burst because that cell wall holds them in place. But it was called turgor pressure. When a plant has this water in their cells, the cells bulge a little bit. That causes them to stack hard against themselves, and they keep that plant upright. As soon as a plant gets kind of dehydrated, it wilts. And wilting just means that we're losing that pressure, right? And so the cells aren't stacking very tight against each other, and so that plant wilts. You water it again, those cells fill up, the turgor pressure increases, and it pops back up again. So how do we balance all these things? Well, again, some kind of cool pictures of the stomas. You can see these ones are pretty much closed. These ones are wide open, letting water out, water out, oxygen out, and carbon dioxide in. And just to make sure, I think all of you know this, but I think sometimes the details get overwhelming. Remember that water does not enter through the stomas, right? You cannot get water into there. Water's through the roots, carbon dioxide is through the stomas. And so the leaf may transpire more than its weight in water each day. This loss must be balanced with the plant's need for carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. So a pretty intricate process there. Although, again, form meets function. I'll say this one more time. Guard cells, right? It gets a little bit more complex than this about why the water rushes in, but it deals with kind of what we talked about with the roots yesterday. If you pump some minerals into the roots, we said water will follow by osmosis, right? Same idea with these guard cells. If there's a lot of water, the water will enter the guard cells. That's kind of how we'll just start it. When the guard cells inflate, they bend. When they bend, since they're bending in opposite directions, they form a hole. Well then, if your plant is getting dehydrated, it's going to start to steal water from the guard cells, right? Water's going to rush out of the guard cells, which deflates them. So now they're deflated, so they collapse on each other, which means, well, now the hole's closed, which means no more transpiration's happening. Then that plant is protecting its water. It receives more water from the environment. Now there's enough water to enter the guard cells, so the guard cells inflate, they open back up again, and again, a pretty good explanation of the structure and the function and how they're going to be working together. Not much to say about this slide. Again, just kind of showing our two systems, and they are related. They kind of help each other out. They depend on each other. So the roots depend on the sugars produced. It deals with a couple different areas. For one, the roots need the sugars in order to grow, right? It takes energy for that root to be growing and snake into the dirt. So it needs it for that. Roots are where plants store energy a lot of times as well. Meanwhile, so you got these sugars going down, and also brings up a good point that we'll talk about in a minute. Sugars can go both directions. That phloem can transport either way. We'll talk about how that works in a little bit. The shoots, however, depend on the water and minerals that are going to be absorbed by the roots. And again, that's the only place that water can come in. As simply as we can put it, it pumps the minerals in. That causes water to rush in. It can't get backtracked. It kind of can go in but can't get back out again. And so that starts to produce a pressure that starts to push that water up. And then, as we talked about yesterday, that cohesion and adhesion, water kind of starts to climb up. And so water and minerals going up the xylem is a one-way flow upwards. So xylem can only go up, phloem can go both ways. But they depend on each other for both these systems to actually function. Now there's three main tissues that make up a plant. So we have three organs, right? Roots, stems, and leaves. And now we have three different types of tissues, three main types of tissues. And we're going to leave the most technical words out of here and not really break them down much further. But we have dermal tissue, we have ground tissue, and we have vascular tissue. Now, what is your dermis? Skin, right? If you have a skin problem, you go to the dermatologist, right? Well, plants have a dermal layer as well, and it's their skin if you want to think of it. It's their outer layer. And so, it's basically the skin of the plant. If we backtrack to those leaf diagrams, you'd see that there's an epidermis layer on the top, right? One layer of cells on the top, which is also covered by a waxy cuticle. What does that cuticle do?
Keeps moisture in.
Good, keeps moisture in, right? Nice waxy layer, water can't get out of it. And then there's a layer on the bottom that's a dermis as well, right? Both sides, right? You have skin on your front and your back. Well, so does that leaf. And so it's this layer of kind of skin, tightly packed cells that covers and protects the plant. There's not much more that we're going to say about that, but you should understand the dermis, or that epidermal layer. The ground tissue is almost easier to talk about last, so we might come back to it. But the ground tissue is basically what most of the plant is. If it's not that skin layer, and if it's not the vascular tissue, and the vascular tissue is just the veins, right, the xylem and the phloem, everything else is going to be the ground tissue. So when we looked inside that snippet of the leaf, we're not talking about the top layer, we're not talking about the bottom layer, and we're not talking about the vein that's running through the middle. But everything else in that leaf is ground tissue. So that palisade cells where the photosynthesis happens, the spongy mesophyll cells with those gaps in it, right? All those things that are in the middle of that leaf is the ground tissue. So we look at this picture over here. So the vascular bundle in this picture is running up the middle. This white layer is that single-celled dermal tissue, which means that all the yellow, now this is inside the root, similar inside the stem, right? Here's all that space I was talking about inside the leaf. So all that yellow stuff is the ground tissue. It's the main bulk of the plant. if we took it from your body perspective, and you are not a plant, just to clarify, but if we ignored your skin, if we ignored your, let's say, circulatory system, right, we'll say that's kind of like the xylem and the phloem, everything else on you would be this ground tissue, right? So it's the bulk of a plant. And then finally we get this vascular tissue, which is your transport system in a plant. Now notice that vascular tissue, in order to be considered a root, a stem, and a leaf, in order to use those words, it has to have this vascular tissue. It has to have this xylem and phloem. Which is why even some of those protists, like the seaweed, and you say, man, that really looks like a plant. Look at those leaves. They're not really leaves because they don't have a vascular system. They don't have those veins running through them, so they're called blades. And those roots aren't really roots because they don't have a vascular system, and so they're called, in most protists, they're called holdfasts, right? Because they hold on to, they kind of anchor it down. So it needs to have this xylem and this phloem, and we'll talk more about those in a little bit of detail, but we can see running up the stem. In this particular one, it forms a ring. That's one way to tell the difference between a monocot and a dicot, by the way. Here we can see some veins emptying out into the middle of the leaf, delivering its water, pumping those carbohydrates away that's made in the leaf, and then of course the roots have to have that system as well. So a little bit more about the vascular tissue. One thing to point out is that vascular tissue, the xylem, there's a couple things to know about the xylem. If you know nothing else, you should know that the xylem transports water. And the xylem is composed of dead cells. Think of it mostly like drinking straws. What's going to happen is it's actually made up of a couple different cells called vessel elements and trichids. But ultimately, they're these cells that are essentially dead now, and some of the barriers between them kind of broke down, and so it starts to form these hollow tubes that water can start to get pumped up. And it makes sense that way, right? It's going to be a lot easier to transfer this through hollow tubes than to try to pass it from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next, right? And so again, very good example of how form or function meets structure, right? Its function is to pump water 140 feet up a tree, right? We want to do that as easily as possible. So it moves water and minerals from the roots. They're dead cells. Once they're maturity, obviously they have to be alive at some point, but then once they are where they need to be, they start to break down to form this xylem. So basically you only get the cell remains. The cell wall remains. You take away the inside, so the cytoplasm's gone, right? That's just going to slow down your water. You don't need the nucleus anymore or any of those kinds of things. And so we just keep our exterior supports, and that provides this channel or this tunnel to pump water. And transpirational pull is helping out, right? The water, once it gets to the top, is coming out of those stomas, and so that's pulling the rest of the water up, right? Because of cohesion, the water's liking each other. And there's also adhesion. Remember, that's when water's attracted to something else. Water is attracted to the inside of those vessel elements and tracheids, and so it's actually clinging to the wall and kind of climbing up on its own, plus being pulled, plus hanging to each other, plus there's that root pressure that's pushing from the bottom. And all those things combined are going to help to force that water up against gravity. So again, dead cells is pretty important. So again, as we're going through that, keep in mind of that whole, what is the structure, right? What is the basic structure? What is its function, and how are those two things supporting each other? Now the other half of the vascular tissue, this is just transporting water. And remember, it's one direction. Has to come in the roots, has to get up into the leaves. So it's going up. The phloem is a little bit more confusing because the phloem doesn't just have to go up. The phloem can go, or the phloem doesn't just have to go down, which is what most people think. The phloem is going to go where it's needed. And so if you think about, okay, so, well, the phloem is going to carry the sugars and the nutrients throughout the plants, right? And so any part of the plant that's growing is going to need food delivered to it to make sure that it has the nutrients to break down to provide the energy to continue to grow. Other parts of the plant are going to be in charge of storing in the extra parts. And so this is basically going to go a couple different ways. Now in the phloem, there's two different types of cells. There's called the sieve tube, and there's called companion cells. Probably, that's kind of a minor point for us. If you can memorize those names, that's great. You should at least be able to kind of recognize them. If you read that word, you're like, oh, that's part of the phloem, that's part of the vascular system. And a difference between this phloem, not just the fact that it's carrying sugars and nutrients instead of water, is that these are still living cells. So these are not dead, emptied out old tubes like the xylem is. And so these different elements, you can again see that if you take the right cross-section of it, you can see kind of the tube form. And as I said, they're living cells, so they do have the cytoplasm, the cell membrane. What's going to happen here is they're going to control diffusion. One of the questions you answered in your reading guide for today talked about the fact that, well, how do you get the phloem in here? And that phloem was actively transported into the cells. If you remember reading this, it was one of the last questions on your reading guide that I just checked. The phloem was actively transferred in, and then what's going to follow? Well, water, right? Water's going to follow, and so now you've got water flowing in. All right, so you actively transport the sugar. Water follows, and what's that going to do to the pressure? It's going to raise it. And so now you've got this higher source of pressure wherever this sugar was made. Because wherever it's made, that's where it's going to get pumped into the phloem. Water follows, and water's building up this pressure, and that's going to force it one of the directions. It's going to force it towards, if we use the terms from your book, it's going to force it towards the sink. You have the source, that's where the products are made, and you have the sink, that's where the products are either going to be stored or used. And so it's kind of an interesting way to allow this whole process to happen. And so, again, mostly on this slide, just kind of recognize these structures as being part of the phloem, and that's about the level of detail we'll go into on this slide. Just being able to recognize those. For example, in a multiple choice question or something like that, you would know that they're talking about this phloem. Okay, so phloem transports the sugars. It can go both directions. It's composed of these sieve tubes and these companion cells, and they're living cells, unlike the dead xylem. So the last couple ideas here, when we transport the sugars into the phloem, this is what I was talking about a little bit ago. You're going to load the sucrose into the phloem, and that's going to be a process that takes energy. So you're going to have to put that energy into it to get it to happen. Then you are going to allow water to flow through. It brings up a structure that I think we got in back in chapter 5, and that was the plasmodesmata. They're those little gaps, the junctions between plant cells. We also talked about gap junctions and some other things during that time. So it allows them to actually flow between these gaps. You can see the gaps right in there. And so the phloem can pass from one cell to the other through these plasmodesmata, which is why you don't need to empty out the whole cell like we did in the xylem. And essentially, since you're going to pump things in, you're going to pump the sucrose into those cells. Well, as a result of that, we're going to see water is going to follow in. And if water is going to follow in, here's our water coming up from the xylem. Here's our phloem. Notice here is our source, right? A leaf is a good example of a source. It's where photosynthesis is being done. The sugars are being made. We're going to pump that sucrose, that sugar, into the phloem. Water's going to look at that and say, hey, wait a minute. I need to try to dilute that. I need to go from a low concentration of sugar to a high concentration. So some of the water that's going up in the xylem gets sidetracked, and it jumps over into the phloem. And then you end up with a pressure here because this water is building up, and so that's going to start to push everything down, in this picture down at least. It's going to push it away from the source, and it's pushing it towards the sink. In this case, they're saying it's a root, and that root is going to store the energy. Or perhaps the root's going to use some of that energy to grow and continue to get longer and longer. And so again, it deals with this mass flow hypothesis, going from the source to the sink. So the flow, the direction of transport in the phloem is dependent on the plant's needs. So some phloems will go up to a higher up structure, and some will go down. So the upper leaves will kind of supply the growing tips of a plant. The bottom leaves are going to be pumped down towards the roots to supply the roots with energy and to have some transport there. And so this phloem loading, the active transport of sucrose into the phloem, which increases the concentration, which decreases water potential. That's going to be something that you're probably going to definitely want to review over the next month or so, the whole water potential idea. So that water, because it's now a lower water potential here, the water goes from a high water potential to a low water potential, flows into the phloem from the xylem cells. That creates a pressure, and that pressure pushes the phloem to where it needs to be. So again, a pretty impressive system. Again, this whole kind of structure meeting function idea. And so, again, a source from your reading guide is something that produces sugar. Now, there's another way of interpreting a source. Something like let's say a potato, right? Kind of a tuber idea. That could be a source or a sink. If it's storing and collecting and storing the energy, the sugar, at that particular moment, it is going to be a sink. If later on, though, the plant decides to use that energy for its own good, it's going to become a source. So it can vary depending on the time of the year, even the time of the day, or just on the particular function. Last couple points, we can see that vascular tissue is different in dicots versus monocots. Dicots, as we saw this in another diagram a couple days ago, it's in a ring. Monocots are just kind of scattered around. So even the vascular tissue differs. We saw that the roots differ, tap roots in dicots, fibrous in monocots.